Everybody. So this is a presentation that is being done remotely without an audience for posting on WCAT.world for distribution through the Faith-Based Online Learning Directors Organization. My name is Dr. Sebastian Mahfood, and I will be your presenter today on a webinar entitled Flipping Emergency Remote Teaching through Audio and Video Podcasting. So this is a topic that's very near and dear to me. I very much enjoy the kind of work that I do in remote learning. We call it in distance learning jargon. We don't call it remote learning, we call it online learning. Some people call it distance learning. And recently, in the spring of 2020, we've called it emergency remote teaching. Now, emergency remote teaching is a lot different from online learning in that all of the assessment norms and all of the normative modes of engagement and a face-to-face course suddenly had to be shifted to using distributed means. So faculty members began working with their students through email and through a learning management system perhaps that had been set up for them, and so on. And the goal was to complete the way the course was actually designed to be delivered for on-campus, face-to-face classroom teaching and learning. We're about to move into the fall of 2020, where many campuses will not yet be allowed to be open. So teachers over the summer of 2020 have to retool. They have to find a way to engage in something that's more than just emergency remote teaching. They have to actually start using some online teaching and learning techniques. That is, techniques that were developed for an online learning mode of delivery, or distance learning mode of delivery. And not just, we're going to continue doing what we did during the period of emergency remote instruction or emergency remote teaching. So not only do we have to do what is necessary for emergency remote teaching, but in the fall of 2020, we're going to have to up the game a bit. And for faculty who have not been through online learning courses or online learning instruction, ways in which to develop themselves into teachers who can teach within an online mode of delivery, that's going to be hard. So this summer of 2020 is an opportunity for everyone to learn how to face the possibility of a fall 2020 where the entire semester is going to be taught online. Unless there's some way to bring the students back midterm into physical classrooms. But according to the Department of Education, that may not happen. For the very first point, I'm going to talk about flipping the classroom, what that means. And then I'm going to talk about audio and video podcast creation. Now, and then I'll show a couple of examples. So in the world of emergency remote teaching, just to summarize, we took all of the face-to-face courses that had been designed and normed for on-campus face-to-face teaching. And around mid-semester, we began delivering those courses through alternative means of delivery, through email, through learning management systems, and whatnot. But we were in a rather uncomfortable position because we had lesson plans, course designs that were suited for on-campus delivery. So, for instance, even in the lecture discussion format, a faculty member would stand in front of the classroom and would deliver a lecture and would engage the students at a certain point during the process of that lecture, during the time of that lecture. And in a classroom of 25 students, if 6 students engaged and responded in one way or another over the course of the 75 minutes or the 50 minutes or the 2.5 hours, depending upon how the classroom was formatted, then it was a good lecture. It was a good class time. But when the professor left the classroom and ended up having to teach from home, all of that material, that content delivery, that the professor would normally just spew in the classroom, just basically from memory, stand in front of the students and engage the students, that content was no longer able to be delivered using that method. So faculty who plan out 15 weeks worth of lessons or classes suddenly kick into high gear on what my good friend Jim Rafferty calls anapolstrophobia, which is the fear of not covering all the material. So how do they get the lecture content to the students? Many faculty went into Zoom mode, and we saw a huge increase in the amount of Zoom usage, the amount of freeconferencecall.com usage, the amount of any video conferencing system, really, WebEx, and so on. As teachers endeavored, or faculty members endeavored to continue engaging their students. And the students would log in, and we had some synchronous activity, and that was how a lecture was delivered. So that's on the fly. If we're going to plan for doing that in the fall of 2020, that's great. It's called hybrid delivery. And what happens is you bring the students in real time so that they're all face-to-face in Zoom or whatever the video conferencing mechanism that the school likes to use is being used. And then you deliver to students, a faculty member who's not in the same location as the students, delivers to students in distributed locations content, and everybody comes together in the same time in virtual space. So that's one way to do it. Flipping the classroom involves preparing those lectures beforehand and providing students with the lecture content prior to their coming to class at all. And then when they come to class, if this were a normal face-to-face classroom, what they would do is they would be able to engage in certain activities. And those activities could be any number of things. And so let me move to the next slide, and we'll talk about some of them. I should get the slide to start over at the beginning. There we go. So flipping the classroom. So the time and the space has to do with where people are located when the teaching and learning environment. When you have structured instruction, how is that time and space negotiated? Is it done entirely in the classroom? Is it done partly in the classroom and partly online? Or is it done entirely online? And then entirely online, is it done synchronously or asynchronously? So some things to ponder as we move into time and space. When we talk about time and space, we're really talking about accreditation. We're talking about an assessment structure where the United States Department of Education, USDE, which accredits our accrediting bodies, has come up with a formula. Now, prior to November 2010, life was different for institutions of higher education. They could offer a 3-credit course, and they had a definition of a clock hour. So they knew that students, if they came for an hour of instruction, the definition of the clock hour was 50 minutes. Or if the students came for an evening of instruction in a 3-hour per week course, the clock hour was really 2 hours and 50 minutes, minus 20 minutes for break in between in the 2 halves of the course. So really 2.5 hours. So a given clock hour or a given week is about 2.5 hours worth of instruction. So in November 2010, the USD applied something called the Carnegie Unit to that. And they said a Carnegie Unit means that we're going to have students studying in class for a certain amount of time. So this is the normative time and space is everybody's together, faculty and students in the same room for the same amount of time. at the same time, so completely synchronous. So the Carnegie Unit established 1 hour in class and 2 hours outside of class per week for 15 weeks equals 1 credit. Now this made it a bit interesting because suddenly those people who were teaching online courses had to conform their online courses to on-campus standards. So on-campus courses had traditionally met for 15 weeks, sometimes 16 weeks, depending upon the length of the semester in any given institution. And they would meet for roughly 3 hours a week and assign homework. So in terms of a formula for all of that, the Carnegie Unit provided it. If a student meets for 1 hour in class, that student has to do homework for 2 hours. So maybe an hour of homework to prepare for the 1 hour in class, and an hour of homework afterward to do activities. Maybe. Teachers could structure it however they wanted. But this was normative now for our schools. Whereas before, you could have a teacher just give lecture for 15 weeks and never assign any homework. And I had classes like that when I was an undergraduate. Not so many when I was a graduate, but as an undergraduate, I could get by just on the lectures and preparing for the exams in many of my courses. But with 2 hours outside of the class per week, the instructor has to kind of figure, okay, what am I going to assign? That's roughly 2 hours. And, you come up with a formula. Like if you're reading a book, a student can read about 25 pages an hour. If it's technical stuff, maybe 18 to 20 pages an hour. And you can figure, okay, well, if I'm going to give them homework, I'm going to give them 35 pages or 40 pages or 50 pages. I'm going to say that's about 2 hours worth of preparation for the next class. So when this scales out to 15 weeks, it comes down to about 37.5 hours of direct faculty instruction and 75 hours of homework per 3-credit course, which is a total of 112.5 contact hours. Now, a third of those are direct faculty instruction. So in a classroom environment where you're physically on campus, standing in front of students and speaking, kind of like what I'm doing now, I can count that as direct faculty instruction. In an online environment, I can also count it as direct faculty instruction. So if I were to take this podcast after we're done with it, this webinar, and I were to post it in a learning management system on, let's say, a week 1 lesson tab, I could count this entire hour that we're about to spend for 1 hour of direct faculty instruction. So in a given week, I need 2.5 hours. And then in a given term, I need 37.5 if we've got a 3-credit course. And that's putting the definition of the credit hour in relationship with the definition of the clock hour. So if they're saying 1 hour in class and 2 hours outside, that looks like 3 hours. It's really 50 minutes equals 1 hour. So it's 2.5 hours per credit. So 7.5 hours per week. So if you're designing an online course, you're designing it so that the student will be engaged about 7.5 hours per week. In the world of emergency remote teaching, these formulas aren't necessarily put together in a systematic or intentional manner. The faculty member will find some way to provide lecture content. And some of those ways to provide lecture content may come in the form of YouTube videos. Whatever the faculty member is doing. The faculty member is, in the world of the Carnegie Unit, in the world of online teaching, has to be more intentional about how that faculty member is engaging the students. And a YouTube video that doesn't have the faculty member's voice is really more of an outside of class activity. It's more of a homework activity. A YouTube video that does have the professor's voice, where the professor creates the video for the purpose of the class, that could be considered direct faculty instruction. A faculty member sitting and grading papers is not direct faculty instruction, but a faculty member engaged in a discussion board with the students in a public forum is considered direct faculty instruction. So, so there's various ways to toggle whatever that formula is going to be. But we do know that in a 3-credit course, we need 112.5 hours of student engagement for that to really count in a world of accreditation, for that to count as a legitimate 3-credit course. So, flipping. So flipping the classroom means moving the in-class lecture content to the homework section and using class time for collaborative activities. Now, if you think about that formula that I just discussed, and you were to apply that formula to a flipped classroom, you have no difficulties. That is, if you've got to give 2.5 hours of direct faculty instruction per week, you can deliver that content remotely via mediated communication, via audios and videos that you create and post for your students to consume. Now, in an online, in an on-campus classroom, that means that you would give that to the students and say, this is your work that I want you to prepare for when you come to class, because you're going to need to have this content already listened to or engaged or whatever the lecture material is. Because when we come to class, we're going to do things that are different from my lecturing to you. We're going to do group work, we're going to do panel presentations, we're going to do field experience, any number of things. In your own teaching and learning environments, you already know the kinds of things that your students are doing for homework. When they leave the class, they get in groups, the groups discuss, and the groups come back to class. And you're going to flip that and give the students the class time to do that. And it makes some sense to do that, because in a normal class, where a faculty member is speaking for 75 straight minutes, occasionally getting sound bites out of the students, but not wanting to deviate from the PowerPoint or from the outline of the lecture that he or she has already created because of that fear of not covering all of the material. In that kind of classroom setting, what you've got are a handful of students, maybe as many as 25 students, or in a large auditorium, 300 students, who have come together in the same time, in the same place, for the activity of listening to somebody speak. They can listen to somebody speak on a podcast. When you've got that many people together in the same time, in the same place, do something interesting with those people. That's the concept of flipping. Have them engage one another. Have them turn toward one another with whatever widget that they have in hand, which is maybe a lecture that the professor has given them online, and they've got some review questions that they're going to talk about as a group, and then at the end of their time together, they'll be able to speak what it is that their group thinks about that material. And in this way, you're not just having students from learning from one another, you're having students discuss with one another what they've learned from the content expert, from the professor in the room. After they have some kind of discussion, and there's got to be a purpose to their discussion aside from them coming up with answers, they can put together panel presentations, and they can actually present on what it is that they have discussed and what it is that they learned from the content, and thereby demonstrate that they're meeting one of the student learning outcomes. Student learning outcomes in today's educational world are king. So if you've got student learning outcomes in your syllabus, everything that you do in terms of activities, in terms of student engagement and whatnot, is designed for the purpose of demonstrating that the students have met those learning outcomes. And this is why assessment is so very important. You know, you talk about assessment with some people and they say, well, you know, all of my students made A's, so they're doing well. At which point, well, you say, well, assessment really isn't about the grade. Assessment is about whether or not the activity that the students are doing are meeting the student learning outcomes, and whether the student learning outcomes in any given class are meeting the program learning outcomes. So that when a student actually graduates, that student has demonstrated competency in all of those learning outcomes. And so assessment is really about whether or not the activities are designed and can be validated to do what it is that they're designed to do, which is demonstrate the students have met learning outcomes. And in some cases, you're going to apply rubrics. You're going to have to develop a rubric first and apply it to whatever activity you've given the student. And you're going to find that the activity itself doesn't demonstrate anything about whether or not the student can do the learning outcomes. At which point you go, oh, I either need to change one of two things. I need to change the learning outcomes in a way that would enable them to still be normed to the program outcomes, or I need to change the activities. And when we talk about changing learning outcomes, we're really talking about a curriculum review. And the curriculum review shouldn't happen just in one class, although professors are constantly revising their courses in order to make them better. They should happen program-wide and on a schedule. So every 5 years, for instance, or every 7 years, as you're coming up to preparing your next self-study for the next reaffirmation of accreditation visit, you would take a look at the entire curriculum and say, okay, here are the successes of the curriculum, and we're basing this on alumni surveys. And here are some of the weaknesses of the curriculum, and we're basing this on any number of things, maybe also alumni surveys. And these are the things that we're going to do to retool this curriculum. So, so when you flip, you're flipping within a measured structure. What you're doing is you're saying, okay, it makes sense for me to set my lecture content, to sort of offshore it, as it were, for the purpose of freeing up class time for students to actually demonstrate that they can engage the material while I'm watching them. And while they're with one another, because maybe when the students disperse, they don't have time in the evenings to come together in meaningful group work. The time that they have would be during the time you have them. So online, this would be something different. Let me flip to the next slide. At least in terms of group work. Online, you would have this kind of scenario via Zoom. And Zoom has Zoom rooms. WebEx has rooms where students can do breakout sessions with one another. And maybe if you don't have an institutionally paid for Zoom, you find another creative way to do it. My wife teaches at Webster University, and she teaches in the School of Education in Special Education. And for the past 8 weeks, she's had her students come together in kind of this format where she talks to them through Zoom, and all of their pictures are on the screen and everything. And then she sends them to work on their own in the specific rooms that have been designed for them. And then 20 minutes later, she pulls them back into a larger plenary setting, and she engages them about what it is they discussed and what are their outcomes for that discussion. It's not just free discussion. They have to have specific outcomes for it. And they have to meet those outcomes by the time they come back. So, panels. One of the ways to demonstrate those outcomes, and my apologies for the architecture in print. I went to Wikipedia to find a free image of a panel, and this is what popped up. So a panel discussion would be to say, okay, all these students are going to come together, and they're going to give a presentation to the class, and they're going to field questions for it. And the faculty member can assess their preparedness, the kinds of questions that they put together, the kinds of the demonstration or whatever that they brought together against a rubric that is mapped onto the student learning outcomes. So it's not simply I'm going to stand up and give a presentation. I'm going to do it within a given context. And I'm going to demonstrate that I have the capacity to work within a team in presenting and preparing this material for others. And that I'm able to field questions others may have about practical applications. And practical applications is the third part. Field experience. Now here's a practical application. This is St. Paul speaking in the Areopagus. So as we know, St. Paul learned everything he knew about Christianity from Christ himself, and then began preaching it. So we have 13 Pauline and Deutero-Pauline books in the New Testament. We have evidence of Paul's activity, and we have his story about all the hardships he faced in pursuing this activity. If you would apply a rubric to Paul's engagement of his field experience, of his ministerial program, and come back to him around 63 AD, before he ends up in Rome, executed by Nero, I think in 64. Then you could say that Paul, as an alumnus of the institution, has met all of the learning outcomes and has demonstrated proficiency in the world. We would want to do something very similar with our students in terms of field experience, is to lay out specific outcomes and have them demonstrate that they're able to meet them. And then later come back to them after they've graduated and been in the workforce and seeing whether or not those outcomes still play out in terms of their activities, in whether or not they're still able to demonstrate that they are institutional, that they're continuing to benefit from the fruits of their experience at our schools. So all of this can be done intentionally through flipping an online classroom in the way that my wife's done it. So in the course of her lectures, or the course of her content delivery, we'll call it, the content is now delivered remotely. It's delivered through podcasting or through video casting. Students review that content and they come together in groups through Zoom. So this is a hybrid form of engagement. And when they're together in real time and real space with her, she sends them to work with one another to do panels and to demonstrate proficiency in field experience. There's a whole section in the School of Education that is based on field experience that they haven't been able to get this term because they haven't been able to go into classrooms. All the schools are closed. So the field experience they're getting is through creating Zoom rooms of their own with their students and with their colleagues in whatever school that they've been assigned. So it's a very interesting world in which we live, but a very unintentional engagement in today's world, because this came upon us all of a sudden this spring. And if we're going to hit fall, we need to plan. And we need to structure our lessons and our courses in the way in which we're going to engage our students in a manner that is not as haphazard as it was this spring. So that's flipping. Now, in terms of audio and video podcast creation, I'm a strong proponent of either. This is the kind of video podcast that you can create. What you do is you go to Prezi.com, you create a short presentation like I've done here, and I've been showing Prezi this whole time. And you open a Zoom room, or you open some kind of screen capture and recording device you might have. In this case, I opened a Zoom room because my hope is for interactivity among participants. But I could have just as easily done this completely on my own, using a screen capture software, and then posted that. But as soon as this is done, I'm going to do something clever with it. And audio and video creation can be done as simply as using an iPhone or a Samsung or whatever device you have, if you're going to do it asynchronously or outside of time and space with other people. If you're going to do it synchronously, you can also use an iPhone for it. Right now I'm doing this entire presentation via my iPhone, which is set up to Zoom. And I jumped in with my desktop computer as another person in the meeting. And that other person in the meeting, which is me, is able to show my screen. And I can show some slides and some websites and some other things, which I'm about to do. But the technology is something we already have in our hands. And for those that don't have this technology in hand, the means by which to procure it are very inexpensive in terms of the kinds of things that these softwares can do. There's a big impact. And all of the schools right now, as I pointed out in a webinar last week, are in receipt of federal grant money that's designed to cover costs for faculty who are going to, or institutions that are affected by COVID-19. And one of the things that Secretary DeVos says in the grant money is that she encourages us to use it to expand our capacity to deliver content in a distributed way. So that's huge. That means that schools now have the funding, if they didn't have it before, for providing their faculty members with things just like this. Now, the funding is a generous amount. It's $500,000 per school. And that's for schools that did not get as much as $500,000 in earlier distributions of funding. And we're not counting the payroll protection program. That's a separate account. We're talking some institutions have received a great deal of money in the emergency funding that they've given the schools. It's the HEERF student emergency funding, the HEERF institutional matching funding, and then the HEERF FIPSI funding. Now, the student funding in many schools of our size, with theological schools that are standalone, is something in between $20,000 and $80,000 per school. But then whatever you don't get in student emergency student funding, you receive in FIPSI funding. So Holy Apostles, for instance, received about $22,000 in the student funding, which means that we can give $11,000 to students who were affected by COVID-19. We give $11,000 to the institution to take care of institutional needs. But that meant we were also then eligible for over $477,000 more dollars simply for the asking. And Secretary DeVos said that there were about 971 schools that didn't receive at least $500,000 in the initial disbursement. So this disbursement is meant to bring all schools up to $500,000. And all of that is the subject of a podcast that I've just posted on distancelearningdirectors.org that was delivered last Friday. So I won't go further into it, but simply to say that money is available. Schools that are embedded, less money is available. In fact, if the university into which they're embedded received a great amount of money, then those theological schools will receive nothing, or may receive nothing. At which point, I would say any rector or president of an embedded theological school should go to the main office and ask about distributing that funding in a very equitable manner. But not to digress too much, but if you don't have the resources are available. Now, a lot of these resources are free. I use two resources. One is Spreaker.com, and the other is YouTube. Now, Spreaker, I pay a little bit of money for, and I pay the money because I've got a side gig, if you will. I started podcasting using a relatively free service, which is basically my creating a video or an audio and posting it on my own website. And then I discovered Spreaker. Actually, I didn't discover Spreaker. My friend Luca Stucchi in Bergamo, Italy, discovered Spreaker. And you may recall Bergamo from the news. They've recently been hit very hard with coronavirus. In fact, they were the biggest country on the planet with the virus outside of Wuhan, China, until the United States caught up and passed them. And then Spain showed up on the map. So I'm going to talk about both of these. First, Spreaker.com. If you go to Spreaker.com, you're going to sign in like this. Let me click it. And what it's going to look like is an opportunity for you to sign up. And if you sign up, there's a number of different plans you can sign up with. I'm going to log in just to show you what it looks like on the internal side. I have a radio station, and I'm going to show you the radio station. In the fall of 2016, it began as a way to promote books from my publishing house, En Route Books and Media. Back in the fall of 14, a friend of mine and I started a publishing house. Over the past 5 years, the publishing house has published 130 books. And the radio station that was founded a couple of years later has managed to create 70 different radio shows. And the radio shows are, some of them promote En Route Books and Media, but many of them have their own ministerial life. They've taken on their own existence, like Practical Catholic by David Cease, is something that's outside of En route Books and Media's system. But it's the kind of thing that is what En route Books and Media would do, which is Catholic spirituality. And all of this helps support the promotional initiatives and the marketing initiatives of Holy Apostles College and Seminary. We founded the publishing house to publish books by the faculty, and then we founded the radio station to advance the themes of those books, and so on. So any one of these shows, and let me jump on to just, since I mentioned Practical Catholic, let me jump onto it. So on a regular basis, the show host of this show, and the last one he produced was right at the beginning of coronavirus outbreak, so I hope to have more shows from him coming up. The host of this show has produced 52 episodes where he's talking about ways in which to practically engage or engage in practical theology from a Catholic standpoint. I could walk through all of these shows and tell you a story about these shows. But importantly, I don't have to tell too much of a story because it is embedded. Let me jump back on my presentation. In the main story, which I've begun here, of the robustness of something like Spreaker.com. Now, the cool thing about Spreaker is, let me jump into a, I can create new podcasts, I can upload new episodes, and so on. Let me jump into one of these. I'll go back to Practical Catholic. The Spreaker has a distribution network that will distribute your content through all of the various social media. So it'll take it through your Facebook account, your Twitter account. I mean, you click publish once, and it hits all these media at the same time. Your YouTube account, YouTube, Twitter, Tumblr if you've got one, SoundCloud, etc. But then you can distribute on a number of other platforms. So every time I click publish on one of David's shows, it goes to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Castbox, Deezer, Podcast Addict, and Podchaser. So these are important outlets for people to receive content. So imagine your students being able to tap into their Spotify account and listening to your lecture material, or if they're already on iHeartRadio or whatnot. There are ways you can make it private. So if you don't want a lecture going out to people who are not part of your system, you can tag it as private, and only those people with the link will be able to hear it. In which case, you take that link and you post it in your learning management system, or on some platform that the students have access to that you're using to engage those students. So that's Spreaker. YouTube is something that you already know about. YouTube, if you have a Gmail account, and it's easy to create one, you can create your own YouTube channel. And whenever you want to upload a new video or post, you click here, upload video. Or you can go live. So I can do live broadcasts through YouTube. And all that my students need to know is what my address is. That's my address. So that being the case, they can watch you live, and they can type in the chat field questions at you while you're speaking. And then after you're done speaking, after you've gone live, you click sign out, and that entire session that you just created auto-saves to YouTube, to your channel. And so you can see I've got on my channel, this guy, Rami Simeon, is doing lectures on the Gospel of John. And he's done like 30 lectures so far. This is the presentation I did for FIPSI and the government funding. This is a radio show where the interviewer, Peter, met with Deacon Peter Leverick, met with his interviewee, Father Aaron Agorsor, who's just published a book with En route. So they decided to do it through Zoom, and so I posted their interview as a video as well as an audio on my podcast site here on Spreaker.com. So So these resources now are available for anyone to use. Anybody can go to my Spreaker or my YouTube channel and grab them and then paste them in their own classrooms, in which case they don't become direct faculty instruction, they become homework because it wasn't the faculty member who did it. Let me go back to presenting. So that's a podcast post. So to take you a little bit further into the world of WCAT, this is what my site looks like on a website that I built to host all those Spreaker videos or audios. So rather than just have the content sitting on a platform where students would have to, they might have the address to one show, or they might have the address to all of the shows. What I wanted to do was find a way to package those shows within a context that I could do other things. So for instance, this is where the idea of WCAT Radio's website was born. So WCATradio.com, listen on demand. The shows are parsed into days of the week on which they post. And these are the shows. So if I go into, let me go into one, I can think of one that has actual content other than the shows. And the shows are good content in and of themselves, but to have content outside of those shows, like links back to books or links to audios or videos or things like that. I've got one right here. Annabelle Mosley's show, Then Sings My Soul. I believe I have on her page, I have a picture of her. I have the player, which if I click, let's say I want to go down to episode 21 and click play, it'll play it right here in this field. And then I have links to her other appearances, other interviews that she's done. So I'm able to use a web page to consolidate not only her shows, which appear on Spreaker and all those other places I just shared with you, but I can also post other stuff on her page. And if I were to go to, and I need to post this link, I just realized I don't have it, enroutebooksandmedia.com/Sacred Braille, I can go to her book page. And she wrote a book called Sacred Braille about the Rosary, and En Route published it this past year. And so this is the book page. And then we partnered with the Xavier Society for the Blind to get the book printed in Braille. So it's now available in Braille and for free to all Xavier Society members. So in terms of Annabelle, who teaches theology at St. Joseph's Seminary, Dunwoody in Yonkers, and at Seminary of the Immaculate Conception in Huntington, New York, this is a valuable resource for her own classes. So it just so happens that we're able to make it available to the larger public. All right, so that ends today's session. And thank you, everybody, for participating, especially Jenny for attending during this session. And if you have any questions or comments, please send them to us at distancelearningdirectors.org.